All right, hello everybody. So that was the intro music that I was playing for you all while you were in the waiting room and people were still trickling in. So it seems like we have pretty much exactly 50 people in the room right now, which is a really good turnout. I'm really glad to have you all here and to walk with me through the practical introduction to Prisma workshop that I'll be hosting today here. To kick things off, I want to walk you through the Notion document that we'll use as the main materials for today's workshop. And I already put that link into the chat. So you can now all go ahead and open that document, but you don't have to because I'll also go ahead and share my screen and just walk you through the most important steps. And 1 second, I quickly want to configure my audio properly here. Okay. All right, you should all hear me okay. If there at any point is something where there are problems with audio or video, I tell you, for example, that I'm screen sharing, but you cannot actually see my screen, which has happened to me a couple of times in the past, then please just write that in the chat and I'll see that. Okay, so here is the Notion document that I shared with you before, and really it's the materials that we'll use for the entire next 2.5 hours. So the prerequisites for this workshop are really small. So the only thing that you need really is, wait, I get a Zoom alert here. Your microphone is not working properly. The voice of other participants can still be recorded, but your voice cannot. Check my microphone. Let me quickly test. All right, can everybody hear me? Would be great if you can hear me, then you can quickly write that in the chat. Okay, yeah. Chirag says, okay. All right, perfect. Seems like when I wanted to configure my audio before that somehow I messed up the Zoom settings and didn't select the right mic. But obviously that has worked now. Okay, so we've done that. And I can continue with the prerequisites here. So really the only thing that you need for today to follow the workshop is to have a version 12 or 14 of Node.js installed on your machine. And that's all you need. I would recommend that you use VS Code for, I get the same Zoom alert. Double checking the mic, but I think everything should be okay. Next time I'll just click continue recording. Anyways, I recommend for you to use VS Code, and that's mostly because VS Code works really well with TypeScript, which is what we are going to use today. And there also is a Prisma VS Code extension that also enables syntax highlighting and auto-completion for the Prisma Schema file. So it's certainly recommended, but if you have a preference for your own editor, then of course, you're very free and welcome to use that one as well. So what are we going to cover today? So in this workshop, you'll learn about various workflows that are useful to know when using Prisma. And you'll start by setting up Prisma with a SQLite database, learn about data modeling with Prisma, and performing database migrations. That's all in lesson 1. Then you'll learn about Prismaclient, a type-safe query builder that can be used to query your database. And you're going to explore various queries from CRUD to relation queries to filters and pagination. And then we'll put the newly gained knowledge into practice by implementing the routes of a REST API and even implement a couple of resolvers of a GraphQL API. And don't worry if you haven't worked with REST or with GraphQL before. The way how I've set up these tasks for you is pretty straightforward, so that you only have to go and clone a specific repository. And then there are basically the slots where you have to fill in the blanks in order to get the application to work. And yeah, I've set some time for the individual lessons. So we are now starting with the setup, then comes Prismaclient, then REST API and GraphQL. I roughly expect this to be 2.5 hours. Could be a little bit faster, could be a little bit longer, but kind of like the 2.5 hours is the mark that I'm aiming for. There was another question to post the Notion link in the chat. I'll do that again. Here you go. And then I have prepared these 4 lessons. I already talked about them. We'll dive into them in a bit. And what does a lesson look like? So really, that's about the structure of today's workshop. And a lesson is always structured in 2 parts. And that's basically a recommendation of mine for you to get the most out of this workshop. So we'll start at the beginning of each lesson with the host walkthrough. And in this case, the host is me. And what the host walkthrough is that I will show you what you're supposed to do in each lesson. I'll do some explanations around the topic that we're covering. And during that time, I recommend to you to just be attentive and follow what I'm doing so that when you get the time to actually work on the task yourself, you actually know what you're supposed to do. So I really recommend to you to not starting to code along as I'm showing and explaining things, but really just watch, observe. If you have any questions, then you can drop them in the Q&A and I can get back to them. And then in the second part of each lesson, you will always get some dedicated time where you can actually work on all of these tasks yourself. All right, who is this clown who is talking to you here? My name is Nikolas. I really like educating other developers and helping making them successful in their work, and of course, especially with the Prisma tool. So I personally have been with Prisma with the company for 4.5 years now, so quite a long time. And over that time, I've talked to countless other developers that wanted to start having an easier time with their databases and learn about their pain points. So hopefully today will be a good opportunity for you all to dive into Prisma and learn how Prisma can resolve some of these pain points that typically people experience when working with databases and with traditional ORMs. A couple of logistics before we start diving into the first lesson. So if you have already noticed, and wait, am I sharing screen actually? Yeah, I am, sorry. The Zoom controls, they just disappeared. If you have a question that you want me to answer, then it's recommended that you use the Q&A section in Zoom. So you all should see a Q&A section, and I can see all questions that are coming in there, and I can either type an answer or I'll just respond verbally here on the stream. You can, of course, also use the chat, but there is a good chance that I might miss that question then, but maybe other people can respond to it. So like, you're not really supposed to use the chat if you want me to answer any questions. But of course, for general chit chat and maybe questions that you rather want to direct to other attendees, there you can definitely use the chat. This workshop is being recorded and it will be published on the Prisma YouTube channel afterwards, but you all are very anonymous in this workshop, so I don't think this is really anything that you have to necessarily worry about. And this is one feature that I'll use a little bit throughout the webinar. Mostly when I want to know who is done with their tasks, I'll ask you to raise your hand. Yeah, and Sam was quick to do that and find the button. So you can actually go ahead and click the raise your hand button now and test that feature. And indeed, I see a lot of different raise hands. Ferenc, Adam, William, Leo, Evelyn, Tanmoy, Craig, David. Okay, there's way too many names that I can count here now. But it seems like you all found that button and that feature. Then, of course, we have a code of conduct here. We want this to be a safe experience for everyone. So please be mindful of the other people when you write anything in the chat. And finally, or almost finally, this is a little bit of a call to action for all of you. If you are also into kind of teaching other developers and you like, like teaching and educating other developers, then this is an opportunity for you to host this workshop yourself. For me personally, I have to say that I love hosting workshops, and it's also a really, really great way to deepen your understanding of a certain topic and also give back to the community by sharing your own knowledge. So all of these materials that you'll be using throughout this workshop are completely free to use for you if you want to host this workshop yourself. Maybe you want to do it in the context of a meetup, or just bring a couple of friends together and do a Zoom online session similar to this one. In whatever context you might want to teach this to other people, you're certainly allowed and very much welcome to do so. And finally, we have a Prisma Slack with over more than 43,000 developers, and you're all invited to join us there. There is a Prisma Day channel where I expect a lot of activity today and tomorrow. So if you join the Slack, then be sure to also join the Prisma Day channel 2021 there and get in touch with other attendees and Prisma folks, of course. Okay, so that's it for the intro, and I think it's time to dive into the first lesson. And here is the first lesson. I just clicked on the page inside of Notion, so you're invited to do that as well. But for now, as I mentioned before, you should rather focus and follow what I'm doing here instead of already trying to do the tasks at the same time. John, I see your question on the chat, whether we also have a Discord channel. So first note on that, if you want me to respond to a question, please try to use the Q&A section, because otherwise I might miss a question if you pose it in the chat. But now to actually answer your question, we don't have a Discord yet, but that's an ongoing discussion that we actually have internally. And it's very likely that we'll soon set up a Discord as well. But as of today, we only have Slack and GitHub discussions as well. So in our main Prisma repo, you can ask questions via GitHub discussions. All right, first lesson. The goal of this lesson is to set up Prisma, get comfortable with Prisma's data modeling language, and perform your first database migration. And in order to do that, you have to go through the setup instructions here that are coming from the README that I've linked. And conveniently, all the commands that you need here are also already part of the GitHub README. So I'll just go ahead and copy and paste these CLI commands into my terminal. And then I'm opening up VS Code for that particular folder. That's all the instructions, of course, that I had to run through for the README. So let me go back to Notion and explore the first couple of tasks. Once you clone the repo and install the NPM dependencies, you're ready to get started on the task of this lesson. And for what it's worth, the entire Notion document, you could actually theoretically walk through it by yourself. So it's basically a long, comprehensive tutorial that has all the instructions and solutions for you. Okay. I see from David in the chat that the edge of my screen is not visible. Is that the left or the right edge? Or actually, let me quickly check if I can change settings here. So I am sharing the entire desktop. So now you should see on the left side VS Code, and on the right side you see Notion. But you say that it's cut off left and right. Is that the case for everyone here? Okay, it seems like that for most people have no issues with the screen sharing. So in that case, I guess I'll just continue. Hopefully, David, this is going to work out for you as well. I'm not really sure what I can do to resolve this. But otherwise, hopefully in the recording, you can catch up with everything later. For now, maybe it's also okay to just have a portion of the screen. Yeah, so I was saying that this Notion document, it's basically also an in-depth tutorial that you theoretically could walk through yourself. But I think it's always better to have somebody at hand who's actually explaining this stuff, who's maybe showing this, pointing out a couple of caveats and quirks every once in a while. So that's why I still am here to instruct you with this, and of course also to answer your questions. But I'm going to read the first task for you here. So the task is about creating our first Prisma model. The Prisma schema sits at the core of every project that uses any of the Prisma tools. The current Prisma schema looks like this. And here we have an overview of that. And I can also open that inside of VS Code. And it's indeed almost the same. Actually, I can correct that right now, that we're not using environment variables to configure the database URL, but just we hard code a string to a SQLite database file in this case. So it specifies the database connection to a SQLite database file via the data source and indicates that you want to use Prismaclient by specifying the generator. You don't really have to understand anything about the generator yet. We'll get there in the next lesson. In addition to the data source and generators, the Prisma schema also contains your Prisma models, which are Prisma's representation of your database tables. And that part is important. And in this case, you'll create your first Prisma model that should be called user with 3 fields. One field is ID, another field is name, and another one is email. And they all have specific properties that I have to adhere to when I create this. Now, the way how I define a model inside of the Prisma schema is just use the model keyword. And even that, like, by the way, is also aided by autocompletion in this case. And now I can give a name to the model. I use curly braces. And at the moment, it still complains because in order for a model to be valid, I need to have some kind of unique identifier on it. And most of the times, that's going to be an ID field. In this case, we'll use integers as the type for this ID. We're annotating it with the ID attribute that makes the error go away. And in the underlying database, this is going to create a primary key constraint on this field. And then we can also provide this default value of auto incrementing. So we actually provide a function here to this default attribute that's auto incrementing the integer, the ID whenever we create a new record in the user table. Then there should be a name. This is a string, and it says it should be optional in the database. So I'll put a question mark right behind the string to indicate that this can be null. And then we'll put the email. This is required and uniqueness I can achieve with the unique attribute right here. And then I can also go ahead and format my Prisma schema so that the fields, the field types, and the attributes are nicely aligned in a columnar layout. All right, so this is the first model that we are writing. And you can always go ahead and compare your solution with the solution right here. And in this case, I'm a little surprised that my solution matches the one that is shown here. Actually, in my dry run before, I think I expanded all of the solutions, so I actually have to collapse them again. But all right, we now have the first model, but we really only changed the file on the file system at the moment, but we really didn't do anything in terms of like setting up a database, creating a table. Like all we did is we changed the contents of a single file. So in order to actually apply these changes, we will have to run a Prisma CLI command. And in this case, we want to use Prisma Migrate, which is our tool that allows you to create and modify database tables. And the command that we're looking for is called npx prisma migrate def. And then you can provide the name for the first migration that you want to create here. And in this case, I'm going to call it init. And if I run this, then we see that there is a bunch of output. First, we see that there was apparently a new database file that was created. The database is now in sync with the schema. And let's go ahead and actually check on the file system. We actually see that this defdb, the SQLite database file, has been created. And so has a folder that's called migrations with the information about the very first table that we wanted to create. So all of this has been generated by the Prisma Migrate command that I just ran, so that we know what is being executed against the database. Okay, so that was the first thing. And now I want to show you a nice little tool that comes with every Prisma project, and that's called Prisma Studio, which is basically a GUI for your database to view and edit the data that you have there. And I can select my models here. So at the moment, I only have a single model, and I can go and create a new record. And in fact, I think the task here is to create 3 database records. So I'll go ahead and create 3 records for me and a couple of colleagues of mine in DevRel. So Etel and Mahmoud are going to be my compagnons for this one. And then our emails, they all end with prisma.io. One super quick caveat: when you click Save Changes here, make sure that you unselect the latest one. Wait, why? I don't know why that happened, but I'll just redo that. I probably must have missed the way how I created a new line or a new record here. Anyways, here we go. I'm creating 3 records, and before you hit Save Changes, make sure to unselect the last cell, otherwise it won't be stored. So we already have 3 database records. And now it'll be your turn to go through the same steps that I just showed you. So first, go to the startup project on GitHub, clone the repo, and then walk through the same tasks that I just showed here. I'll give you roughly 5 to 10 minutes of time for this. In that time, I'll mute myself and disable my video, and then turn the video back on in 5 to 10 minutes and ask you how far you are to continue with lesson 2. All right, I'm starting the video again to comment on a couple of things that have been raised in the chat. So first of all, I reshared the link to the Notion document. Hope that all works for you now. Then Shafia made a comment that the @types/node are missing in the project. So maybe you've got an error there. Actually, that might very well be. Actually, for me, you just saw it, it worked on my machine, but I've actually heard from other folks that this has been a problem before. So what you can do to fix this, if that was an issue for you, is you can just go ahead, npm install, then @types/node, and then you usually do that as a dev dependency so that the types don't get deployed to your production app. But if you do that, then the types node should appear here, and I believe any errors that you might have been experiencing should be gone. All right, you can go and raise your hand if you're already done with all of the tasks that you were supposed to do here. So quite a few of you are raising their hands. That's great. In the meantime, while the rest of you are wrapping up, I'll go and respond to the questions from the Q&A that have been raised. So first, the first question is, what is dev.db journal used for? And I actually don't fully know. I believe this is a concept that just comes from SQLite. And now it also actually made me curious. And like, you know what? I actually Googled for that, and also checked if we had any issues in the Prisma repo that were talking about this, but I couldn't find anything. But I'll try to follow up and maybe ask our migrations team that are working on Prisma Migrate, that probably know about the specifics of SQLite here. And then hopefully I can like follow up in a later part of this stream today. Is it possible to create the schema in an object or JSON format? That's a really good question. And by default, this is currently not possible. So the only way how in the first place you can create your models is indeed by using Prisma's modeling language. There is a tool that allows you to translate the Prisma schema language, what you see here, into JSON schema. So that actually exists. I'll actually put a link to that quickly in the chat. So you can use this to take what you wrote in Prisma schema language and translate it into JSON format. But the other way around is currently not possible. That being said, there are two community projects that are enabling you to do this actually. So one, I think, lets you define your Prisma models as TypeScript types, as TypeScript classes. And another one, I actually don't recall how you do it there. I think like the other one is more of a Nexus style, like GraphQL Nexus, if you've like worked with that, is a library to define GraphQL schemas. And I think the other library that I'm referring to here is similar to that one. And I'll try to find the links for both and also drop them in the chat later, but I don't have them at hand. So to recap, it's not possible to do this natively, to use object or like the JSON format to create your Prisma models, but there are libraries out there from folks that rather wanted to use TypeScript classes or other ways to declare Prisma models. And so you can use these tools instead, and I will drop the link to them a bit later. Resend the Notion link. I've done that already. Are there any VS Code extensions useful when using Prisma? Really, I think the only one is the VS Code, the Prisma VS Code extension, the like native one. I'll drop a link to that in the chat as well. And that's the only one I think that you really, really need. I don't think there are any others that you would require when working with Prisma. Can you tell us which linter you're using for Prisma suggestions? I guess this is just the Prisma VS Code extension that I was just referring to. So all the auto completion you get here is powered by the VS Code extension that I installed and where I just dropped the link in the chat. Another question about the Prisma VS Code extension, and like now I'm thinking I should just have pointed that out before. So sorry for the confusion here that apparently the question emerged in all of your minds at the same time. Yes, the answer is there is a Prisma VS Code extension that I just dropped in the chat. There's one question about storing images. I'll save that one for later. How did you align the columns in the Prisma schema? So for me, the alignment actually works by just using the formatting shortcut of VS Code, which I've mapped to Control-Shift-F on my keyboard. But this can also be configured to update the layout on every save of the file, which I think a lot of people do as well. For me, I like to have an explicit shortcut. Do the migrations work for multiple databases? Can I build it for SQLite and Def and then use it with MySQL or Postgres in production? That's also a really good question that I would like to elaborate on a little bit further. So first, the first answer is, can you also use this migration that was created here for another database? And the short answer for that is no. Prisma Migrate generates the SQL according to the dialect of the database that you're using, and that's configured here as your data source. So if this says SQLite right here, then the generated migration by Prisma Migrate will be in the SQLite dialect. If this were to say Postgres, then this SQL would look different and it would only be runnable for a Postgres database. And the second question that you raised here, Shishir, was you, whether it's possible to build it in SQLite in development and then use MySQL or Postgres in production. This has come up as a, a request a couple of times in the past. And in fact, in the first couple of months after releasing Prisma or when running it in beta, this was actually possible. However, we went away from that model for two major reasons, I think. First, we actually found that this is actually not that much of a common use case for people to really want that when they're building a real world application. So a lot of the people we talked to really didn't care about this at all. And then secondly, one thing that you have to be aware of when using Prisma is that Prisma is trying to leverage all the features of the underlying database so that you actually can make full use of the feature set that the particular database that you're choosing has to offer. So for example, coming back to that example using SQLite and Postgres for the same application, what if you wanted to use enums in the database? Well, enums are a feature that are not supported in SQLite, but they are supported in Postgres. So that makes it difficult for us to say, when you now start to define an enum here, that when you're using SQLite, it's actually not possible, but then when you switch to Postgres, it is. So in fact, you will see that like an enum is actually not allowed for SQLite, but if I now switch this again to PostgreSQL, then this is allowed suddenly. So like we're not trying to put a single abstraction like the Prisma schema as the one abstraction on top all of databases, but we're trying to account for the features and the specific powers and strength that each database has. I hope that makes sense. If you have a vastly different opinion about this, Shishir, you're more than welcome to create a GitHub issue. Our product and engineering teams are always looking for valuable input to design our product roadmap. So they will be happy, I think, to engage with you on that question if you really think that's an invaluable feature. All right, I'll pick one more question and then I think we'll move on to the second lesson and I'll spare the other ones for when the end of the second lesson. A question from Ferenc. Migrations. The migration was based on the current snapshot of the ORM model, but in reality, a series of migration deltas results in a schema that should be equivalent to ORM. In our demo case, the two are equivalent. The migration delta and the kernel. So how is that supported? Migration data in the current ORM. I'm not sure I fully get the question, to be honest. So how is that supported? I see data that should be to ORM. In our demo case, the two are equivalent. So if I understand your question correctly, then you're wondering about this Prisma schema file, basically, and how it relates to the migrations and the database schema. And like at least one thing I can tell you is that this Prisma schema file is supposed to be the source of truth for what the database schema looks like, and also for what the generated Prisma client looks like that we'll use in the next lesson. And it's declarative, so it's always only representing a single state. But the generated migrations here in the migrations folder, they of course change over time. So this migrations directory, it gets populated with more migrations over time. And in fact, you'll run a second migration in the next lesson, and you'll see that there will be a new folder that's created here. So this folder is to keep track of the migration history, whereas this schema.prisma, it always only represents kind of the target state of what you want your database to look like. I hope I answered this question. I assume I didn't. If there are still points that you really want to have discussed here, then feel free to just go ahead and re-raise this question in the next one. All right. Oh, cool. It seems like I did answer the question. That's great. Okay, but enough talk. Let's go back to the first page and move on to part 2. Lesson 2 of this workshop. The goal of this lesson is to get comfortable with the Prismaclient API and explore some of the available database queries that you can send with it. You'll learn about CRUD queries, relation queries, filtering, pagination, and along the way, you will run another migration to introduce a second model with a relation to the user model that you already created before. You can continue working in the same Prisma workshop project that you set up in lesson 1. The script.ts file contains a main function where you can put your database queries. So I'm going to go ahead and show you this file. Here is what it looks like at the moment. This is a very plain TypeScript script that can be executed with npm run dev. When I do it right now, we won't see anything. We'll just execute an empty main function here. And this is where we're going to write our queries with Prismaclient. 3 quick hints that I want to share with you all in order for you, again, to get the most out of this workshop is to go and type yourself and not copy paste. So even if you have to look up the solution, I think there is like nothing that beats the kind of muscle memory that you're going to develop when you type things yourself. So my strong recommendation for you all would be to not copy the solution from these expandable sections at the end of each task, but rather really just type them out, even if you expand the solution here. Then Prisma has a beautiful auto-completion feature thanks to its strongly typed nature. And I'll show you what that looks like in action. Here is a little bit of an explanation how to invoke that, which I'll show you in a bit. And then Prisma Studio, we already got to see that in the first task. And here is also just a repetition that you can run the script with npm run dev. All right, so the first thing that we want to do here is we want to write a query to return all user records. And we should print them with console.log then. So here is how you write queries with Prismaclient. I'm going to store the results of my database query inside a variable that's called result. And if you have already noticed, we're using like this async keyword here that allows us to go and await a Prismaclient query. All Prismaclient queries return promises, so that's why you need the await keyword. And it's very neat here, the auto-completion that I've talked about before. It's being invoked, and I can see all of the different kind of top-level functions I can invoke. But in this case, I actually want to query for the user model, prisma.user, and I can put another dot here, and there is more auto-completion, and I see all the different queries that I can send. And the task was to write a query to return all user records, and I think the appropriate query for that is probably find many. And then I'm logging the result like this. And I'm calling npm run dev in the terminal, and I see that the 3 user records that I created in Prisma Studio just before or just at the end of lesson 1 actually are printed to the console here. Okay, so the next one is to create a new user record. So let me go ahead and again use the auto-completion to guide me here. There is a create method. That's probably what I need. And then the cool thing is that this auto-completion, it not only works for the kinds of queries that you can send, but also for all the arguments that you need to provide or that you can provide per query. And in this case, for create, we need to provide an object that's called data. And in here, we can provide the values for the fields of the model that we are creating a record for. And in this case, my task is to create a record with this email and only an email, so not with a name. And let me run again this query npm run dev. It gets printed. It seems like it worked, but in order to validate this, I can pull up Prisma Studio again. Let me see if I still have the tab open. Here is Prisma Studio, and we indeed see that we have the new user record just with an email, not with a name yet. But that's happening in just a bit, I think. Write a query to update an existing user record. In this task, you'll update the user record you just created and add a value for its name field, and it should be called Alice. So let me go ahead and do that. This time, I guess there is an update method that I can invoke with autocompletion. Now it complains because in order to use update, I actually have to provide two objects. One is called where and one is called data. The where object is needed to identify which user record should be updated in the first place. And for the where object, I can identify a user record by any unique column or field. And in this case, I'm going to use the email. So I'm going to do this, just copying it over. And then my task is to update the name here to be called Alice. So that's what it looks like. And let me go ahead and use npm run dev again. It seems like it worked. I can validate it in Prisma Studio, and I expect that this name is now appearing here. Perfect. So 3 pretty straightforward Prismaclient queries that we now fired against the database. Here in this lesson, I'll show 2 or 3 more tasks, and then you will get the time to work on all of that by yourself. So the next task is actually to add a post table to the database. And that's so that we can explore more interesting Prismaclient queries, because the new post table should have a relation to the already existing user table. So let me go ahead and open the Prisma Schema again, where we are going to do that. And I'll just type out everything as I'm recommending you to do. ID int, this is just going to be the exact same as before. I'm using all the auto completion. So there is supposed to be a title on the post. That's a string and that's required. Then there is a content field that should be optional. There should be a published field. So this doesn't give any indication about the type of the field, but the published field should indicate whether a post is published or not. So it has 2 states, and I think that's a good idea to be represented by a Boolean. And we can even assign this default value here to make sure that every new post record that's being created by default is not published. And then it needs an author ID. That should be optional, and then a Prisma relation field that we're adding here. And the relation field is actually of type user itself. And here you already see that I'm getting red squiggly lines. And the reason for that is that every relation in the Prisma schema requires relation fields on both sides of the relation. And at the moment, this user field, it only exists on one side, on one model, pointing from user from post to user, but we'll also need the other side here to point into the other direction. And then another thing that we need to do is we need to add the relation attribute to this relation field right here. And specifically, we need to tell Prisma what the foreign key is here. Fields references, it references the ID field on the user model, and the field is just the foreign key that we're defining on this model, which in this case is author ID. I'm formatting my Prisma schema again so that everything is lined up properly. But as you recall, I now only changed this file on the file system, but I didn't actually change anything in the database yet. In order to change something in the database, recall that we have to run this Prisma Migrate command in order to create a new migration. And that's exactly what I'll do right now. Prisma Migrate def is the command that I'm using in this case. It seemed like it worked. Let me go ahead and check. So we've got the second migration file and with all the fields that I have defined in the Prisma schema. So that seems to work. So the next task already is to write a query to create a new post record. So let me go ahead and do that again. Prisma.post, and you see that the Prisma Migrate dev command, it not only updated the database table and created a second one for me, but it actually also updated my Prisma client here that I'm importing from this @Prismaclient package and all the generated typings. So I now already have access to post queries just by virtue of having run this migrate dev command. In this task, you'll create a first post record with the title hello world. So again, I'm submitting the data object using auto-completion, and the only thing I have to provide for this one is hello world. That's the reason why I only have to provide that particular field is because the other ones are optional or have a default value. So really the title is the only field that is required when I create a new record. In this case, Prismaclient is smart enough to infer that you don't have to provide the values for fields where you assigned a default value. Okay, so this is the code. I can quickly run it with npm run dev. And I'll quickly go ahead and restart Prisma Studio so that it picks up my new model. Here we go. And now I can see that there is already this one model. And it has the fields that I defined, but it's not yet connected to a user. So that's my next task. Write a query to connect user and post records. There are actually two ways how you can connect a post record with a user. In this case, I will update the post record. And I'll follow the auto completion again. First, I'll use where, and I guess the post that I just created was created with ID 1. So that's what I want to update. And then for the actual data, here is the two ways how I can create the connection between a particular author and a post. And I could either go and directly set a value to the foreign key right here. So I could set the author ID to 1, but I could also do this. I could use 10, and 10 is actually an author ID that doesn't exist in the database yet. And in particular, also, this task here actually says that I should update it via an email field. And author ID is only the foreign key, but I cannot provide an email right here. So that doesn't work. So the way how to do this is by actually creating a nested query via the author relation field, and then use the connect option by the email that we can then connect with the author that we had just created before. And if I run this now, you see that the author ID actually has been set now. And if I go back to Prisma Studio, refresh, and click on this user, I actually see that it's connected now to this user Alice that I had created before. All right, maybe I'll show you one more task here, and then you'll get time to work on everything else by yourself. Write a query to retrieve a single user record by a unique value. Sorry. So for that, I need to switch back to the user model, and there is a function, a query that's called find unique, where again I can use a like any value for a unique field of users. Actually, in this case, I'll use ID and retrieve a user by its ID. And if I run this, it prints out the first user here. And actually, let me show one or two more tasks here, because I just realized that they are, well, hopefully interesting enough for me to talk about them and explain some more bits about them. Write a query that selects only a subset of fields. So usually when you're writing SQL, then you do this, right? You like write select star from user, and this returns all the records and all the fields from the user table. But you can also, of course, always do this in a SQL query and select specific values that you actually want to retrieve in your code. And with Prismaclient, you can do the same. And the way how you do this is to select, to use the select option. Actually, for this task, you can reuse the same find many query for users that you used in task 1. So actually, I'll go ahead and copy this from the first one. And here is how you use the select option to select an individual field. You can use auto-completion again. Here is select. And the API works like this, that you have to provide an object. You get auto-completion for all the fields that you can even select in the first place. And then you just set the value to true for each of these. However, this time you go only select a subset of the fields. Specifically, all returned objects should only contain the ID and the name, but not the email field. So in this case, the query is going to look like this: ID and name, but not email. And let's go ahead and run this and see what's happening. So you see that the array of users that we're getting back, and specifically each object in there, now only has these 2 fields that I selected. And what's even cooler actually is that this is statically typed, so that if I were to try to access now the email field of the returned users, it's not possible, because Prismaclient is smart enough to infer the type of all returned objects just based on this select option that you've included in the query. Okay, the last thing that I want to show, and then you'll get time to work on everything by yourself, is a nested query to include a relation in the result. And in fact, let's start with a nested read where you include a relation. Concretely, take your query from task 7 and include the relation to the post table in the result. So I guess from the find unique, but it doesn't really matter. Actually, I'll just use the same find many query here. Include post true. So the syntax is very, very similar to using select, but for include, you don't select individual fields, but you select relation fields. And if I now print this, I think it'll not print the relation. Oh yeah, it'll actually show you here like the nested posts, which are empty for almost all users, but then one user already has one post. Actually, I think if we do this, console dir, and we provide depth null here, is that what it looked like? And this should print the nested structure actually of the post as well. All right, maybe I'll actually update that in here, so that way you also can see the nested result that's been returned by Prismaclient. Okay, there are a couple of more tasks for you about filters, about pagination, but I'll let you explore these by yourself. I'll give you 10 to 15 minutes to now work on these tasks. I'll disable my video and my audio again, and then in like 10 minutes, I'll be back. Feel free to drop more questions in the Q&A section in the meantime, and good luck with these tasks. All right, please go ahead and raise your hands if you're done with all the 12 tasks. If no, that's still not a problem, but I'll already go ahead and pick up a couple of questions from the Q&A section as you're all still working on your tasks. So quickly coming back to the question about storing images from the last lesson, actually. So for images, you typically use a file storage service such as S3. And I believe a common pattern then is to just store the S3 URL inside of your database. In fact, we will have a tutorial or a course coming out soon by my colleague Mahmoud. He's a developer advocate in our team, and he's currently creating a course where file uploads are an important topic and it will be covered. So hopefully that will answer your question then. All right, another question was, it seems the table name is equal to the model name. Can we change it like users instead of user? Really good observation. Yes, indeed. The table, the name of the model that you specify here in the Prisma schema will automatically be used for the name of the actual table. But you're right that sometimes you want to call this users and maybe you want to call this posts. But we do have a convention in the Prisma schema to always use singular form and uppercase or like camel case spelling for your models. So we recommend that you do this, although it's technically, of course, possible to use the snake case version, for example, and plural form. But if you want to do both kind of, and you want to follow the conventions of Prisma here in the Prisma schema, but at the same time, a lot of databases actually use this snake case notation for field names and for table names. There is actually a way to do that, and that is by using the map attribute here. So you could say that this should be posts, and this should be users. And now if you were to run Prisma Migrate with this Prisma schema, then the table names here wouldn't be post because you're now mapping the user model to the users table spelled lowercase. So that's a way how you can achieve this and how you can kind of decouple the Prisma model names from the table names in the underlying database. Hope that answers the question. Next one from Andreas. Do you issue the Prisma Migrate command after each update of the Prisma schema? I guess that's the general idea, yes, because only changing something in the Prisma schema really doesn't have any other effect than just editing a file on your file system. And in order to then apply the changes to the database, you typically would have to run a Prisma Migrate command. There are different kinds of Prisma Migrate commands, though. Actually, I guess I can quickly show a list of them here. You have Prisma Migrate Dev, Prisma Migrate Reset, Deploy, and Status. So these are the Prisma Migrate commands for different kinds of situations. But I think as kind of just a general rule, I guess, yes, you typically run a migrate command after you've changed something in your models to apply that change to the database and also to the generated Prisma client. Sebastian asked if we share the Notion document later, and I believe someone already dropped it in the chat, so that should be clear already. Is there a way to specify the ID as a GUID in the model? GUID? Is that, wait, I'm getting confused. String. No, GUID, like what? It's been a while since I've been using these ones, but you can use CUIDs and UUIDs. I don't really know what GUIDs are, but they're not supported by default. You can supply default values as CUIDs and UUIDs as well if you don't want to use auto-incrementing integers. That question was by Emil, and hopefully I answered it. If not, you can always go and follow up. Someone's getting an error, ts node command not found. Is that when you run npm run dev? Because the way how this script is set up here is that when you run npm run dev, it automatically invokes ts node, which exists as a development dependency. I don't really know what the issue might be, unfortunately for you. And this is also the tragedy of doing these online webinars instead of in-person workshops, because I cannot sit next to you now and help you debug this issue. So I really hope that you figure it out, but I'm afraid that there is not much else I can tell you. One thing that you might try is to just try to invoke like ts node directly. Like pretty much like this, which comes down to the same thing that's executed when you also run npm run-dev. Maybe that helps. I really hope that you figure it out. All right, seems like I answered Emil's question about GUIDs. For everyone who's interested, GUIDs are actually the same as UUIDs, it seems like, so that's all good. Question by William. Could you explain what is the difference between putting posts true in as a select value and putting posts true as an include value? That's a really, really good question, and I'd be happy to quickly demo that actually. So what William wants to know is what's the difference between using select here and include here? And we'll actually just explore the difference here. So like when I use select, it means that I'm only returning this particular field. So what I'm now getting back here is actually a list, an array of objects that only have a post field, because that's the only thing that I'm requesting. And if I were to use include, then all of the scalar fields of each model are returned by default as well. So now I get much richer objects with all of these scalar fields, but the relation field is included additionally. So the way how I sometimes phrase it for you to remember maybe is that select means that you're selecting the fields exclusively. All of the fields that you're specifying in here are what's going to be returned. And if you use include, then it's include additionally. So in addition to the scalar fields, you can include specific relations. So select exclusively, include additionally. Hope that answers the question, William. Ferenc had a peer dependency problem with npm run dev, and he admits to be a Node noob. To be fair, I think I'm a bit of a Node noob myself. I'm not a very just like experienced Node developer. The last time that I've actually been writing production code is a couple of years ago. So I don't know all the intricacies of Node and JavaScript, but I hope you figure it out somehow. Two more questions from Ferenc, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Actually, I have no idea how I'm supposed to pronounce the C at the end of your name. Ferenc. But your question is, can one author manual SQL migration scripts in case the Delta required is not supported by Prisma? Does Prisma provide migration support for SQL comments on tables fields? If not, can I do this manually? Yes, this is actually very much possible. And the way how to do this is by running the npm Prisma Migrate command, but with the create only option right here. And what that's going to do is it'll create an empty migration on the file system where I can now do anything I want. So here I could use any kind of features that are maybe not natively supported by Prisma in the Prisma schema yet. I can include some seeding if I wanted to, even though Prisma also has a mechanism for seeding actually. But this is really free-form SQL that you can still include in your Prisma Migrate migration history. Hope that answers the question. Ferenc. Okay, Ferenc. You have another question, Ferenc. Adopting Prisma on a DB that already has a schema, the first model would describe the current schema, and when applied, it would be a NOP instead of a failure, right? Would it just show the tail in the Prisma migrations? I think what your question is about is how you get started with an existing database that already has a schema. And in that, for that case, we actually have a Prisma introspect command. And what this does is it actually populates your Prisma schema with all the models that represent the tables in your database. So when you get started with Prisma with a new project, really all you have to do is to add the data source here with the right connection URL, then run npx Prisma introspect, and that's going to populate your Prisma schema with the models. And in fact, we have a guide about this workflow in our documentation that I just quickly want to highlight here. If you choose add to existing project right here, then you will see that what you need is basically the connection to your database. Then at some point you run the Prisma introspect command. Here is like a little diagram that shows the interaction that's happening there, and then it just infers these Prisma models, in this case, from this existing SQL schema in the database. Andreas, 2 more questions, and then we'll move on to the next lesson. Another question from Andreas. Was Prisma, schema, and client in previous versions closer to following GraphQL? If so, why did this change? That's a very good question, Andreas. And yes, you are absolutely right. You have a great hunch here. Prisma 1 actually didn't use a custom schema language, but it actually used GraphQL SDL for this. And also the very first version of, it wasn't called Prisma Client back then, it was called Prisma Binding, but it was a much closer mapping of JavaScript functions to what a GraphQL query would look like. There are a couple of reasons why this has changed, actually. And instead of explaining all of that here, because I can literally talk about this for hours, and I don't think this is why you all are here, I just want to refer you to 2 resources in this case. And one of them is an article that's already dated, but it still contains some truths about exactly your question, and that's how Prisma and GraphQL fit together, where we kind of explain and lay out the product history that we went through as a company. So I'll drop that in the chat. And then another resource that I can recommend here is a live stream that I've done with Json Lengsdorf a while ago. And I'll also drop the link to that YouTube video in the chat so that you can maybe watch it later. And in that video, I talk a lot about the company history, about the product history, and explain exactly that kind of evolution from GraphQL to databases ultimately. I didn't answer the question in detail, but hopefully the resources that I'm sharing here will help you dive deeper. And so I actually really like talking about this kind of stuff. So also always feel free to hit me up with these kinds of questions on Twitter or Slack or wherever you find me. Last question by Leo. When using select, can we use false to omit a field? That's actually a really good question and also a pretty common one that is getting asked. And unfortunately, the answer to that is no. That might be surprising to like some of you, but if you do false here, this is basically always a no op. It just has no impact when you do this. There is a GitHub issue about improving the select API. Let me quickly see if I can find it, where there are, or where it's being discussed that that you can do something like this, or just to improve the API in general, because the use case, I guess, for providing false here is that assume you have a user field with 100, like a user model with 100 fields, and you want to select 99 of them, and there is only one that you want to exclude. Well, the only way how you can do that with the current API natively is actually to spell out the 99 fields and assign the value true to them, and just leave that one field that you don't want to select out of that object. So that's admittedly not a very nice situation. When you have that use case, then you'll probably get frustrated and annoyed by how the select API works. I'll try to find the GitHub issue and link it here. Let me quickly see if I can find it with a very quick search, or if I have to provide it later. Add exclude in the query arguments. I think, yeah, that gets probably close to what you want to see here, Leo. Where's the chat? Here you go. All right. Okay, so if you're interested in that feature, Leo, then go ahead and leave your thumbs up and maybe a comment with your use case in that issue. All right, I managed to go through all the questions. Did you all manage to go through all the tasks for this lesson? If yes, then go ahead and raise your hand. And either way, I think we'll go ahead and continue with the next lesson. That's great. A lot of you are raising their hands, indicating that you've solved all the tasks here. All right, so the next task is about a REST API. And really, the goal of this lesson is to use your freshly gained knowledge about Prismaclient and use it to implement some routes of a REST API using Express. And as I mentioned before, it doesn't really matter whether you've worked with REST or with Express before. Everything is prepared for you so that you don't you only have to insert the Prismaclient queries at the right places in your code, and then things are going to work. To update your setup here, actually, let me stop Prisma Studio in this case. I prepared a couple of CLI commands that how can I remove the terminals? Yeah, that's what I was looking for. I prepared a couple of Git commands and other commands that allow you to just like reset what you've been working on. So I'm now checking out the REST API branch that's coming with the starter code for the REST API. We reinstall Node modules. And then I just quickly want to highlight that, don't save, the new structure of the REST API starter. So first of all, we notice that the dependencies slightly changed. We now have Express as a dependency in here as well. And then the Prisma schema, it's largely the same as the one that we saw before. So the user model actually is exactly the same, but then we have a post model and some additional fields here, a created at and updated at field, a view count field, that's just an integer. And yeah, I guess that's it. These three fields are new. They are also highlighted here. We did delete the database file, so we'll have to run the migration again. The command is provided here in setup. You can just go and copy paste that. And finally, we also have a seed script like setup here that you can invoke with the Prisma DB seed command. And because that feature is currently in preview, we also have to supply the preview feature option right here. But that's what we need in this case. Yeah, so your tasks. You can find the task for this lesson inside the source index, the source index.ts file marked with to do. So if I open the sources directory and open index.ts, we can see indeed that we have these to do comments everywhere. And these are the things that you need to do. I want to highlight that this is not a lesson in API design, and the way how I define or design the API here is very, very straightforward. So the point here is for you to understand the role of Prismaclient inside of an Express server that's exposing a kind of REST API. In real world applications, you should, of course, think a lot more carefully about what you actually want the API to look like and how it makes sense in your particular domain. If you're using VS Code, you can actually install the REST client extension and then test your implementation using the HTTP calls with the test.http file that I've provided here. I'll show you in a bit how that works. And I'm just closing all the solutions that I had open for my dry run. And just start by now implementing the queries, the requests here. So the first one is fetches all users. It's just the /users route with a get request. And that looks very familiar to what we've been doing before. I think the very first query that I sent in the script was the prisma.user.findMany. And I'm just reusing the same one here. And then I return it, or I attach that to the response object that is returned by Express. Now I show you how to test this with the REST client here directly in VS Code. So I'm starting the server with the npm run dev command, same command as before. The server is now ready at localhost 3000. So because it's a GET request, I can just open my browser and point it to the user's route of my Express server, and we already see that this works. This is the data that has been seeded in the seed script just a couple of minutes ago. But if you want to use this test.htp file and you install the REST client extension, then you'll see these little send request buttons here, very subtle, but very helpful. And if I click this, then the second pane on the right is going to open. And that's just like showing what data is returned for this particular request. Cool. Let me go ahead and implement a couple of more routes, and then you already will get time to work on things by yourself. So creating a new user via the sign up route. We already extract the name and the email from the post body. So this is a post request. And just like before, we are using the auto completion. In this case, I need to provide the data object. Again, I'm using auto completion, and I'm just using email and email. I'm passing this and this as the values for the name and the email property. And if you're new to JavaScript, I'll show you a little trick, and like everyone who has been working with JavaScript for a while, they will just go yawn. I know this already, but you can actually do this and use the shorthand object notation if the key and the value inside of an object is the same. The reason why I'm pointing it out here is because I anticipate that there are some people that are not too familiar with Node. And to be fair, when I started working with JavaScript coming from mostly an iOS background, this notation, the first couple of times I saw that, it just confused the hell out of me, and I had no idea what it was. So, and of course it's super simple. And if I had just someone spent a second explain this to me, I would have been incredibly grateful. So I'm hoping that there is one person here that now has exactly this kind of moment. All right, if I want to test this, then I can go ahead and start the server again. I go back to my test.htp file. Here we have a post request defined to the signup route, content type application JSON with these values. So I can click send request again, and we see that it returns this JSON object. And in fact, when I now open Prisma Studio, which I guess this is not running anymore, and px Prisma Studio, just to make sure that the new user actually has been created. And this is the post, and this is the user model. And yes, this is the last one that I just sent as an HTTP request. So the connection from like sending an HTTP request to the API that I'm building with Express here seems to work. I'll implement one more. But I'll be a bit picky about this one. Yeah, I'll use this one here. Increments the views of a post by 1, because this is covering something that we haven't talked about yet, and that's atomic operators as an alternative to, or like one way to perform a transactional operation with Prismaclient. In this case, we're using put. That means we just want to update some kind of value in the database. This is the ID of the post that we want to update. And specifically, we just want to increment the views field, which is an integer, if you recall. Actually, it's called view count. Does this make it? Oh, actually, here it doesn't make a problem because views is just the name I chose for the route. And when I now create the query with Prismaclient, I can, of course, just refer to the view count. So I'm using update. First, I specify which post I want to update by just passing this ID. And because the ID here is retrieved as a string, but the IDs are numbers, I'm using the number constructor to cast the string into an int. And now I'm using auto completion again for data. View count is what we want to change. And now if I provide an object here, then I have these atomic operations that I can apply. And in this case, I want to increment the view count by 1. So if I go back to my server and restart it, and now go into my test.http file again, I can just send this HTTP request a couple of times. And hopefully you all can see how this is incrementing the view count here. And this URL, of course, like this one in here just refers to the post with ID 1. If I wanted to do this with another post, then that's of course possible as well. And just to make sure that everything was applied in the database, let me quickly open Prisma Studio again, check the posts, and specifically check for their view count fields. And yes, post with ID 1 has 10, and the other one has 7 of a view count. Okay, that's it again from my side, and you will get more time to work on these REST API routes now and implement them yourself using Prismaclient. I'll give you 10 to 15 minutes again. Drop your questions in the Q&A, and I'll be back here in a bit. One quick note that I want to make again for Leo about the issue of potentially using false in a select query or in a select option, and what we want to do there. So I'm dropping the link to another issue where we have the proposal for what the syntax could look like. And actually, this is like you will be able to likely define that on a Prisma schema level, fields that you want to kind of exclude by default. So I think that's an interesting way to do this as well. And on that note, I also want to mention that our entire product and engineering process is really happening on GitHub in this repository in the main Prisma repo here. Our product and engineering teams, they are constantly looking at our issues. They are triaging the issues. So when you create a new issue here, be it a feature request, you can typically expect that you get a response from our end within like 24 hours or less usually. And then we'll either, if it's a bug, then we'll try to reproduce it, make it actionable for our engineers. If it's a feature request, then we might ask you for a bit more further information for the use case you have in mind for that feature. Maybe our product team is going to invite you to jump on a call with them to discuss the feature more specifically. So our entire roadmap is really driven a lot by the feedback that we get on GitHub. So I definitely want to encourage you that whenever you think that something should work differently in Prisma, or you had a different expectation and something surprised you, please share it with us, because that kind of information is super important and also very valuable for us. And it really drives and inspires our roadmap and what our engineers are going to be working on. So yeah, I just wanted to point out, use GitHub for everything that you want to be done in Prisma effectively. Okay, let me see. There just popped up one more question in Q&A. Claudio cannot get the seeding to work. The console says that the DB has been seeded, but Prisma Studio doesn't show anything. Again, I'm afraid that's a problem of now not having an in-person workshop, unfortunately. I mean, what you can do potentially is to just run the seed script yourself. So what you can try to just type inside inside the terminal could be something like npx ts node prisma seed.ts, because that's also going to execute the seed script, and ultimately the seed script really is just a TypeScript script with a main function again that's going to be invoked. So that might be a way how you can do it, just skipping the Prisma DB seed step, which effectively does exactly that. So if you call Prisma DB seed, it'll just invoke this command for you under the hood. So this is the raw way how you can get the seeding. But I don't know what other problem there might be with the Prisma seed command. You can double check that the seed.ts file actually exists in your project, although it should, I guess, because I guess you didn't change anything, but just double check. And if the problem persists, I just explained that everything that we do is most likely happening on GitHub and that we're getting back there to users. So it might be that you're running into some kind of bug that's very specific to your local setup. And in that case, I would ask you to go and create a new GitHub issue with as much information as possible about your project. And then our engineers can triage and hopefully reproduce your problem and solve it for the next time. All right, William has elaborated, or actually Claudio also got the seeding to work just by running the script manually. So that was good that worked. And William has the other question. Final task has the following work clause where, or so the default is and. What is then the usage of the and keyword? I solved the draft. Okay, fair enough. So if I understand your question correctly, you're kind of wondering why do we need the and keyword at all? Because the default for combining a filter is already the logical and operator. So instead of writing this, let me just quickly go and show everybody what this is about. So it's about the last query here. The feed query. And because I'm lazy, I'll just copy the solution that I already wrote at some point before. So yes, in here, we're using OR. Actually, like maybe let me write up a bit of a simpler query at this point, just to make the point. So what you're asking, if I understand you correctly, is that when I do this, I say published and view count 10, for example, that now only posts will be returned that fulfill both of these criteria. So npm run dev, I guess there probably is no post in the database that actually fulfills this. Well, to restart it. And I guess run the feed query here. Oh yeah, I actually remembered correctly that there was one that had view count 10. So we get this one in return, but it's the same semantically as if you were doing this, I guess. And I hope I get the syntax right. These are both objects. Yeah. This is pretty much exactly the same now. When I run the same query, I should expect the same result. Yes, I'm getting the same response back. So you're right that the and here is not needed. I think we still have it just for the sake of having a complete API. And to be honest, I don't know if there are edge cases where you maybe need it in some cases, but you're completely right that it can be omitted. And the objects that you're passing here can be directly or are combined with a logical and anyways. All right, I hope that answers your question, Will. That should also be explained, by the way, in our documentation. So when I go here to concepts and expand Prismaclient, I think there is a section on filtering. And if I filter conditions and operators, if I scroll to the logical and, or actually, maybe let me look it up in the reference. All right, I always like to put myself into the shoes of users and actually trying to explore questions with our own documentation. And whenever I notice that like sometimes things are not as well documented as I would like them to be, then I go and create an issue in our docs repo where, again, everything that we do happens on GitHub. So the product and engineering process is happening on GitHub here in the main Prisma repo. But in the docs repo, our docs team is picking up their tasks from here. So whenever you feel that a question that you have on your mind isn't sufficiently addressed in our documentation, then you can go and create a new issue here and request that information from our docs team. Yeah, and the AND operator is not required. This is the same as this one, I think, or these two. Anyways, I think the question is answered. Yes, it is. Happy about that. And let's move on to GraphQL. And just because I like this raising hand feature, who is done with all the tasks in the REST API lesson? All right, quite a few people that are following here. That's always very nice to see. I'm happy to see that you're hopefully engaged in this online workshop. All right, so the last thing, it's a very similar lesson to what you just did. But this time we're not going to implement REST API routes, but we're going to implement GraphQL resolvers. And what we'll do is we'll run through the same kind of setup steps as before to just stash everything that we've been doing in lesson 3, kind of reset our entire project, switch to the GraphQL API branch, reinstall our dependencies, and explore what has been changing in terms of dependencies. Mostly what has been changing is that we now include Apollo server, which is kind of an Express-like HTTP server for GraphQL, and then also a couple of more GraphQL dependencies that are handy in this particular scenario. The data model in the Prisma schema is exactly the same as before. We have to recreate, though, the database and reseed it as well with the familiar commands from lesson 3. And you're ready for your tasks now. So let me go and collapse all these solutions here. And I'll also show you how you can run the queries when you implement them with GraphQL, because that's a little bit easier actually than with a REST approach, I would say. You don't need an extra extension to run them. All right, if you haven't worked with GraphQL before, it's really not that big of a deal. I'll very quickly explain what we see here in this one file in our project again. So it's again called index.ts. And there are 3 important things here: the type defs, the resolvers, and then the Apollo server. Every GraphQL server, it generally consists of these 3 parts, really. One is the type definition. So that defines your GraphQL schema and what it looks like. And you'll actually notice that the GraphQL schema definition language, the SDL, it looks somewhat similar to the Prisma schema language. And that's not an incident, or like it's really not a coincidence, because when we designed the Prisma schema language, we took a lot of inspiration from GraphQL and the ease of use, and especially the intuitiveness and the human readability of the GraphQL schema, and tried to incorporate these properties also in the Prisma schema. So what we're seeing here is a GraphQL schema, which is a schema for our API. It defines API operations. So first, we define, again, 2 types. We just use the type keyword in GraphQL here. We define a user and a post type. And you'll notice that these actually reflect the properties of the models in our Prisma schema. Like in this case, they pretty much map one-to-one to each other, although the syntax, of course, is slightly different. But that's how we define the types of our API. In REST, these would be basically your resources, except that in REST, the schema for your resources is typically not explicit, but rather it's an implicit thing that's just depending on the implementation, unless, of course, you're using tools like Swagger or OpenAPI, where you also define what a resource actually looks like. But then you have 2 more types in a GraphQL schema, and these are special types. They're called the root types, a query and a mutation type. And these are there for you to define API operations. And these operations, they're very, very similar to the ones that you just implemented in the REST API. And I'll show you how to implement them for GraphQL too. So like coming back to these three components of every GraphQL server, the first one is the type defs I just mentioned, the type definitions. The second one is the resolvers. And you can think about it in a way that the type defs, they kind of define the structure. If you have worked with a language like C, for example, you might remember that you had these header files that just define kind of the interface of a specific like C file that you were writing. And the type defs are somewhat the same. They really only define the interface of your GraphQL API, but they don't implement anything. There is no behavior attached to that yet. The behavior is coming through the resolvers. So you have this so-called resolver map. It's a JavaScript object where the top-level fields have to map to the types in your GraphQL schema type definitions. So this query, mutation, user, post, it's not a coincidence that they are spelled exactly the same here. They must be spelled in exactly the same way, because we then provide the type defs and the resolvers to our actual GraphQL server, Apollo server, and Apollo server maps this query type to these query resolvers, this mutation type to these mutation resolvers, and so forth. Okay, enough with the talking and explanation. I'll show you now how this works. Let's go to the all users query first. And again, the implementation here is important, that I'm using exactly the same spelling, including casing, for the queries that I'm implementing. So now I'm implementing the resolver for the all users query. And in this case, we are not attaching that to a response object as with Express, but instead we can access our Prisma client instance on this context object that's passed into every resolver. And we just do our typical find many dance for the very first query that we're sending here. npm run def starts my server. And this time it's running on localhost 4000. And instead of using a REST or HTTP client within VS Code, I'm opening this URL inside of my browser. And what I'm seeing is a GraphQL playground that's hosted at this URL. And in fact, I can see the GraphQL schema here. So this is all coming from the type defs. And it tells me what kind of operations I have available. And this information actually that you see in the schema for the query and mutation type, and also for the other types, is actually extracted inside of the GraphQL playground, also inside of this docs tab, where I can drill into each operation and understand what's the structure of that operation. So for all users, I can see that it returns an array of users, and here I can see what this user type actually looks like. So the way how I write a query is just by opening a curly brace, then using the name of the query, which in this case is all users. And then because I know it returns a user type, or several in this case, instances of the user type, here I can provide the fields of the user type. And if I send this query and remove the docs tab here on the right, then we actually see that we get the data that's currently in the database that was seeded returned. Let me quickly just skip a couple of these and just pick out another one that might be interesting. Yeah, I'll choose the create draft mutation here that I'll also implement. So again, I'll just return the return value of Prisma client here directly. Like create draft, it refers to the creation of a new post record that by default is considered a draft because it's not published. So prisma.post.create. And then I have access to the arguments that I need to provide from the GraphQL query that are defined here. So these arguments actually also, if I look here, then this create draft mutation, it's defined with 3 arguments: title, content, and author email. And of course, these map like pretty one-to-one to the fields that a post has in the database. So I can use the auto completion for title, and I can access it via the args that are being passed into this resolver. Then I can, for the content, I also just pass args.content. And then I get the author email as an argument here as well. It's a string. So again, I have to do this dance connect by email and then args.author email. And if I restart the server, I'll go here, open a new tab. I guess the server's ready, and I'll run mutation, create draft, and now I can provide all the data. Hello world. I'll skip the content because it's optional, and the author email, let's just check who were the users. I'll just copy this one for Alice. And because a mutation, like similar to a query, always has to return some fields, I just return arbitrarily the ID, view count, and published fields. And I see that a new draft has been created, and I can actually create several of them. And I can also request the author, or actually not quite yet. Let me show you something else first. So one neat thing usually about GraphQL is that you can request nested objects. So GraphQL already allows me here to do this and request for each user that I return here also the ID and the title of their posts, for example. And that's somewhat similar also to the select and include API that we saw in Prismaclient, but of course here it's on in a different context on the API layer. But if I do this right now, it's actually not going to work yet. All the posts that are being returned will just be empty arrays, although I'm pretty certain that I just created a couple of drafts for this particular user, and also I seeded data where there were already posts for users. The reason why it doesn't work is related to your last two tasks, and I'm skipping ahead now to explain them. Because you have to adjust also the user and the post, the author and the posts field on inside of your resolvers for these nested queries to work. And that's just by virtue of how the GraphQL resolver system works. But the way how you implement it is fairly straightforward. You just go again, you grab the Prismaclient from the context, and for post, you want to return the author of a specific post. And the way how you do this is by using find unique on post in this case. The post that you need to retrieve here, like what ID do you have to provide? It can be a bit counterintuitive, or actually not counterintuitive, but it's not super straightforward to understand at first, especially if you're not familiar with GraphQL. But this parent object, it carries the ID field that you need to access in this case. So you can do this. And for the posts, you can do something very similar. You just swap this basically. And of course, like here, you have to use the Fluent API and then request the author of that particular post that was retrieved here. And same here, you request the posts. And that's how you implement the nested resolution of GraphQL queries with Prisma. And just to show you that this hopefully now works is when I run the same query, then we actually get the titles. And here I could go a step further and request even more fields that are now all being returned. And because of the way how I set up my resolvers, I can even go so far to now do a circular GraphQL query and again request the author, although admittedly, it doesn't make much sense in this case. Bit of a contrived example just to show you what's possible with GraphQL in this case. All right, that's it from my side again. I will give you some time to work on this, probably again like 10 minutes. And then we're also already coming close to the end of this workshop, pretty much worked out with the 2.5 hours that I anticipated. If you have any more questions, then now is the time to drop them in the chat so that I can pick them up towards the end. But for now, good luck with the tasks. All right, I very quickly want to pick up Kent's question from the Q&A section already, because it's a very valid one that people often ask when they start using Prisma with GraphQL. And the question is, in the all users query, so going back to this one, you're getting all fields from the database with a find many. That's correct. But if the query only needs the name, then you're getting more than is needed from the database. How do you know which fields are needed so you can filter the find many query to not retrieve unneeded information? So to recap for everybody, what Kent is referring to here is, say I do this, and I'm only requesting on the GraphQL layer the name property. So like I really only need the name on the front end. So this query, this GraphQL query is typically sent on the front end and travels from front end to the back end. And there this resolver is being invoked. And then this is going to the database. And in fact, just to quickly show you what's happening here under the hood, when you can instantiate the Prisma client with the log option and then provide query here as a value. And when I do that, then I can see the SQL query that's being generated by Prisma Client and sent to the database. So now when I run this query again, it'll print the select statement that Prisma Client sends to the database. And Kent is right. So Kent already noticed that even though I'm only requiring the name field in my GraphQL query, the database query, it doesn't seem super efficient because it's actually requesting more column names than needed. And this is indeed a potential, or it's like I understand that you can like perceive this as a potential problem. In reality, this is not going to be any kind of performance bottleneck at all. The communication between your GraphQL API server and the database is typically super, super fast, especially if you host them in the same region, if you're using AWS or like Vercel, however you host your infrastructure. If they are located in the same region, then this will be virtually no overhead. And it's just the common practice, like so to say, to just accept that little kind of overhead that's not going to have any real impact on the speed of the query. And like in order for that to really make a difference, you would have to have a really huge set of data with like a lot of different like columns as well, I guess. That being said, it can of course happen that you are in a situation where you need to optimize for that particular case. That can certainly happen, although it's like not very common, and you should probably only optimize for it once you know that this is a bottleneck for you. So it is totally possible to optimize for that. And the way how that works is based on the fourth resolver the fourth resolver argument that's called the info object. And at this point, I actually want to link to 2 Prisma blog posts as well that explain a bit more the concepts behind GraphQL resolvers and also the info object. These were blog posts that we wrote a while ago, but they're pretty timeless in terms of their content. So one is this GraphQL server basics, which really talks about the concept of schemas, type defs, and resolvers that I touched on before. So I'll drop that link in the chat. And then another one is about the info object that you can read as well to understand that. This info object, it's a little bit mysterious in the GraphQL space because it's an essential component of every GraphQL server, but it's not very well documented actually. But what it is, it provides information, or it contains information about which fields are being requested. So in this info object, somehow you have the information that the current query is only requesting a name, and then theoretically you can like pretty much do something like this, where you know that select, and then you have retrieve fields from info, for example, and then you do this, and then you can pass this as the select option to the find many query. So that's how you would optimize for that case if you really need to. But as I mentioned, this is typically really not a performance concern. And I've really in practice not talked to anyone where this ever was an issue. But yeah, this is possible to do it with a pattern like this. Or if you don't want to implement this yourself, as a matter of fact, there is a library that does this for you, which is written by our wonderful community member, Ahmed. He's also a Prisma ambassador. And he wrote this library called pal.js that has a number of different and very handy components, parts that you can use for implementing GraphQL servers with Prisma. And this Prisma select is effectively doing exactly what I just explained to you, in that it will take the info object and then it'll create the select object that it passes to a query. And why not try this out, actually? So now I'm curious if I can make this happen live. I'm installing the plugin. Should only be a couple of lines of code that need to be changed here. I'm using Prisma Select. I'm just copying this from the docs. And let's see what happens if I run this again. Oops. So here's the GraphQL server. I'm sending the same query. Did you mean email? Okay, maybe I'll just give this one more try and just log the select object here to see what's actually going on. I guess. That was my bad. Just have to use the proper syntax here to not have a redundant select statement. But if I do this now, we actually see that only the name column is being requested. Actually, also the ID, but I assume that this is probably has something to do with the query engine internals of Prisma. So yeah, if you do want to optimize, then just go ahead and use Ahmed's library. Should be fairly straightforward. But if you just want to keep your resolvers a bit more simple, then it should be totally fine to just do this and start optimizing once you feel the need for it. All right, that was the last question that was raised in the Q&A. And I think we can wrap up the workshop here. You still have access to all the materials. You are very much invited to host this workshop yourself. As I mentioned in the beginning, all the resources are there for you. You can just go and reuse them. Feel free to reach out to me on Slack, on GitHub, on Twitter, via email, however you want to reach me. Although one quick side note on that is that I'll actually go on a 3-month sabbatical starting on Thursday. So I don't want to make any promises as to how quickly I'll be able to respond either on Slack or email or GitHub. But if it's something Prisma related that you want to ask, then you can certainly always ask this just in the Prisma Slack. And I'm sure that my colleagues are going to be happy to help you there. Okay, one last question because it just trickled in and I want to respond to that. Andreas, can type defs be automatically generated? Are there scaffold methods for type defs or resolvers? This is not a particularly Prisma related question, but more about the Prisma and GraphQL ecosystem. And the answer is yes, they can be automatically generated. And in fact, the pal.js toolkit from Ahmed actually has a tool for this as well, a generator for SDL first CRUD operations, so that you only have to write your Prisma schema and then all the type defs and resolvers will be auto-generated for you, and you'll have just a full-blown CRUD API for just a couple of lines of code that you wrote. And in fact, my colleague Ryan and I, we did a live stream just a couple of weeks ago on the What's New in Prisma like live stream that we do every 2 weeks on our YouTube channel. I think it was a couple of weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, maybe, or actually not 2 weeks, maybe 4 or 6 weeks ago, where I did a demo of the PAL.js CRUD generator on the stream. So you're welcome to go back. We have the timestamps of everything in the video descriptions on YouTube. So if you just click through the past couple of episodes and look out for the right timestamps, it should be fairly quick to find the right episode and to jump to that demo. Everyone, thank you so much for joining today and for your engagement here. That was very, very nice. We have 40 people that made it to the end, so that makes me very happy. And I really hope to see all of you around in the Prisma community. Enjoy the rest of your days. Bye-bye.